The Harvard paper is telling that is potentially one of the best anti-aging drugs. It's a breakthrough because, there's this lack of interest in a generic drug that costs $40 a year. The question, which is incredibly relevant, what's the dose? I have people that 30 years of depression, they're like, I'm 70% better. Fatigue got better. Pain got better. Non-refreshing sleep got better. She said, oh yeah, I don't have any more endometriosis. It's gone. It's kind of crazy that it's taken this long for this study to be done. You can't find a specialist because the waiting list is 2 years. And there aren't a lot of people like me.
We're trying to change the world. All right, Jon, thanks for coming back down to Optispan HQ for the podcast. It's been a while. I can't remember when we had our first go-round at this, but a couple of topics I want to dive into with you today. One, the paper that you were a co-author on about rapamycin and chronic fatigue syndrome, which I've talked about on the podcast before, and the other, of course, being lithium, which you touched on in our first interview, but a lot has happened in the lithium conversation recently, in particular related to Alzheimer's disease. So I'm excited to get into it. And I think maybe let's start with lithium. And you're a psychiatrist by training. So that's probably, you probably thought a lot about lithium, used lithium in that context. What first got you to think about lithium beyond the sort of traditional way that it is used in psychiatry?
Well, lithium was always a metabolic drug. And so if you avoid getting lost in terminology, psychiatrists generally think about using uppers and downers. We use uppers, stimulants and antidepressants for low activity syndromes, hibernation, and we use downers for manic symptoms and psychosis. And it's all cell surface signaling on nerve cells. And then suddenly we have this very odd drug, lithium, that doesn't fit within that framework. And lithium has been the graveyard for psychiatry for 20, 30 years because we didn't have a technology to understand what it was really doing, right? There were these hypotheses that it affected glycogen synthase kinase, inositol signaling, other things as well. But we just didn't have a granular technology. And yet when you see lithium work in patients, it's an amazing drug. You can have extremely ill people be just essentially completely normal and you see them every couple of years, and that's the way it rolls. And then the data came out, in dribs and drabs over the last 10 or 20 years that people on lithium had longer telomeres, had less atrophy on MRI, had decreased death rates, decreased rates of Alzheimer's disease. And, it became clear that for all of us who care about biochemistry, biochemistry is life and life is biochemistry. You can't disentangle the two. And so I made it a real effort to try to go into the source code and understand lithium. I went a lot to the mitochondrial conferences and did a lot of my own sort of clinical work looking at mitochondrial measures. And then, very recently, the field has shifted. That I think the Nature paper just came out maybe a month ago, where a very well-funded Harvard group looking at a well-accepted model of Alzheimer's showed that changes in lithium concentration, dramatically reduced markers of Alzheimer's and possibly changed the inflammatory response to to the amyloid and tau tangles. And that's fantastic.
And that was in mice. They also had human data, right? That in human brains of people with Alzheimer's disease, you saw lithium depletion in certain regions and binding by amyloid.
Lithium depletion. And this is really a major breakthrough, right? And it's a breakthrough because, there's this lack of interest in a generic drug that costs $40 a year, right? And, I've talked with the drug reps about these treatments for Alzheimer's disease. They're $70,000 a year. They require multiple MRIs. They require a specialty team. The waiting list at Johns Hopkins is reportedly 2 years. The waiting list here at the UW to see a specialty neurologist in Alzheimer's is 6 months. And now we have interest that is perceived as legitimate and not fringe. That lithium is worth looking at again. That's a major, major advance.
Yeah. And I mean, it sounds like, from your perspective, you're not surprised by this, but probably pleased to see the attention.
I need all the help I can get, right? I mean, there's no ego involved in just getting your patients better.
Yeah. And I mean, we've spent, billions of dollars on Alzheimer's drugs, most of which have failed. We have a few now that are approved that don't work particularly well, but at least they have some impact. Do you think lithium could actually succeed where these drugs have all failed?
Well, we talked last time about, this new biomarker, the ATN profile, where you're looking at proteins that leak out of a stressed brain that have Alzheimer's. Okay. And I was very excited to have those proteins available because it allowed me to manage the patients that I've seen for 20 to 25 years and be with them at the next stage of their life, right? So the Chinese have some data out looking at these markers, and they estimate that about 25% of people between the age of 72 and 77 are going to start having personality change associated with Alzheimer's. And that may not necessarily be cognitive impairment. They may have, and this is well known in our area, that Alzheimer's is not a disease just of learning and memory. It's of mood. So one of the first signs of Alzheimer's is actually anxiety. And, there's really a bunch of garbage studies out there saying, oh, you shouldn't give benzodiazepines to Alzheimer's patients, because it causes dementia. And of course, it may very well be this is confounding by indication, that the early signs of Alzheimer's are anxiety, right? And so, we're left in this terrible world where we have people, 25% of the population is going to be in psychic pain because of Alzheimer's, even if they don't have cognitive impairment.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess, this is where the definition of Alzheimer's gets murky as well, right? Is it the case necessarily that all of those people will go on to develop at least, classical Alzheimer's as it's been defined historically, or is this really a whole spectrum of conditions, right, that share an underlying,
everything in biology is one web with no cutoff points, right? I mean, this is the problem in medicine when you recruit individuals who are good at memorization, and this is literally a referral bias. So medicine is enriched for highly autistic people. No, it's true, right? That like clear cut points, right? And biology laughs at that. Biology is a continuum, right? And so, what I'm seeing in my clinic now is that when you look for people above the age of 65, you can see stress markers very commonly in these patients. And for some of those patients, if you give them lithium, my God, they feel better.
Yeah,
right. And sometimes their Alzheimer's markers get better within months.
And by Alzheimer's markers, you mean in particular the ATN,
the ATN profile
markers,
right?
Which is amyloid, tau, and NFT,
and neurofilament light,
NFL,
neurofilament light, and of course the question, which is incredibly relevant and really bothered the commentators on the last podcast, is what's the dose?
Sure.
There's this sort of fantasy, that there's going to be some large study done by Harvard or done by a multi-center group, and it's going to come out and it's going to give us a protocol, and it's going to say, oh, you need this dose, and that's the optimal dose to prevent Alzheimer's. And biology laughs at that.
Let me ask you a question. I mean, we can come back to dose for sure. The study in Nature landed on lithium orotate as a particular salt of lithium that was resistant to the binding by amyloid, right? Does that line up with your experience, or does it matter? Or maybe the dose is dependent on the salt of lithium?
I want to go really broad. Okay. I want to go really broad because we get lost sometimes in our models. I think it's really important to think about, when we're in this world of metabolomics, to think about the issue of locality, right? It's maybe the difference between Newtonian physics and quantum mechanics. In Newtonian physics, you see these large objects and you have very clear equations that tell you exactly what's going to happen. Okay. Quantum mechanics is fast time scales, very small objects. And it's even worse. It's a probability distribution, right? So what's really great about this Nature paper is that it brings up the concept of locality, right? That there's a distinction in medicine between endocrine signaling, where you have a chemical like thyroid hormone or insulin that affects every cell in the body all at the same time, versus paracrine signaling, where there's a chemical that's excreted that is only meant to have a local effect. And they bring up this concept of paracrine signaling and locality in terms of the activation in the microglia and the activation of the 6 synapses that are associated with Alzheimer's. In other words, if you just look at CSF, or if you just look at blood, are you looking at a global variable and you're not really able to see the local signaling? Sure. And that's the quantum mechanics problem, right? That how do we look locally and try to understand these things? So their argument is very similar to what the cancer doctors are dealing with in terms of tumor-associated macrophages, where when you're doing immunotherapy to cure a cancer, it turns out that some of the mutations that allow cancer to metastasize are mutations that produce local anti-inflammatory signals, paracrine signals, that turn the tissue-resident macrophages into, it turns off the anti-cancer immune system. And I think this is kind of the argument that they're arguing. I mean, it's a nice argument. I don't think I'm not certain it's as important as they think it is, right? But I understand it, and I love the fact that they're moving us away from these global biomarkers and saying, no, we need to look at what's going on in a quantum world. Very small time scales, very small spatial scales, and how do we understand that?
I guess what I was asking as well is, in your experience, in your patients, do you see any, first of all, do you use lithium orotate as the preferred form, and do you see any difference in efficacy?
Yeah, so let's look at their data. Okay, so when you look at their data, they make an argument that the dissociation constant is different between an inorganic ion and an organic ion, right? And so on the market, we have lithium citrate, which is available and you can get in generally pretty easily. And that's essentially equivalent to orotate in terms of their raw data, in terms of dissociation content. So I have not yet compared and contrasted the differences between an inorganic ion, which is typically lithium carbonate, with the citrate, but certainly, why wouldn't we look?
And what is typically prescribed in psychiatry? What form of lithium?
Lithium carbonate.
It is. Okay.
Yeah. But, there's this kind of odd physical chemistry, and I think this would be a really good discussion with the primary authors, which is, they in their paper say, well, psychiatry typically produces lithium levels that are 1,000 times, the physiological level, right? And so they're arguing the dissociation constant, I don't know exactly what it was, maybe 100 times different, with the carbonate versus the orotate. So I mean, I think it's just physical chemistry. I mean, if you increase the reactant concentration high enough, it doesn't really matter whether it's carbonate.
You can overcome
or
the
citrate,
difference. Yeah.
Right. Now, do you get more off-target side effects? I mean, this is, again, dose finding. I mean, it's the same question, how much available lithium is there in the microenvironment? Do you need 450 of lithium carbonate and 150 of lithium citrate? This is animal data. It's a great idea, but until you hit the clinic, you don't know anything.
Sure. And that's, I guess, what I was asking. And it sounds like maybe we just don't have the data yet. But if there were any hints from your experiences with your patients or other clinical application among the different lithium salts, whether...
Oh, this paper just dropped
I know it's new
a month ago.
I don't know enough about clinical practice to know whether lithium orotate or lithium citrate are commonly used.
Orotate is usually used by the naturopaths, right? Because just for whatever reason.
Well, and they're probably prescribing lower doses.
Much lower.
Yeah.
40 to 50, that kind of stuff. I mean, I had an interesting conversation that your listeners might be, find really thought-provoking, which is somebody watched our podcast last year, and they're in Belgium, and they wanted me to advise on the use of lithium. And, I can't manage a patient in Europe for all sorts of reasons. But I talked to one of their representatives in England, who was essentially a primary care doctor. And she's like, oh, it's illegal for me to prescribe lithium in England.
That doesn't seem right.
No, it's only allowed with psychiatrists.
Really?
So lithium carbonate is illegal if you're not a psychiatrist, but if it's orotate, you can prescribe it.
Crazy. Yeah, I actually just got back from Germany and I asked about lithium and what I was told is they can prescribe it, but you can't buy it over the counter like you can here. You can buy lithium orotate on Amazon, right? In the United States.
You could probably buy lithium carbonate on Aldrich,
Right. Yeah, but I mean, so it is interesting how something like lithium is regulated so differently and actually regulated, like really regulated in certain parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, it was actually, when lithium first came out in Denmark, it was actually illegal because they didn't know how to dose it. And so this was maybe in the 20s or the 30s. And it was illegal to prescribe lithium. And then I think Morgan Schau figured out, we just need to dose a little lower. I mean, this whole issue of dose finding is literally 100 years old with all sorts of interesting regulatory starts and stops. Right. And, it's human frailty writ large, right?
Right. So you mentioned the ATN profile, and I just wanted to dive a little bit deeper on that. So is it your experience that you see, you feel like you see consistent changes in that biomarker with lithium, or at least in some people you see changes in ATN?
Yes, I think the problem is that I'm so busy and I'm such a generalist, right? I'm doing this to some degree because these are people I've worked with for 20, 25 years. I mean, I have a responsibility for them, right? And I'm not going to pretend that there's nothing to do and send them off to Harvard as if Harvard's going to save them. It won't. I know better. So what we see in our patients is that we see many people that have elevations of the amyloid or they have elevations of p-tau, and they don't yet have cell death. So they don't have neurofilament light. They don't have fragments of the axons in their blood. And I think it's going to turn out that if you don't have elevations of NFL, you tend not to have atrophy on MRI. I mean, that's a lovely place to be. I mean, theoretically, your disease is reversible. Right. There's no cell death, right? I mean, nobody wants to get Alzheimer's and nobody wants to get older, but to know that you have time, I mean, that's such a gift, right? And then the Harvard paper comes out and suddenly it's no longer, wackiness, to try that bipolar drug that crazy people take.
Right. So let me ask then: is it your guess that the people who are in that sort of stage, right, where it's prior to significant neuron loss, they're the ones who are going to get the best outcome from something like lithium?
Well, once cells are dead, they're dead, right? You're not going to bring those back, right? And you have a damaged brain, so it doesn't repair quite as well as something like stroke. I mean, you see this in clinical practice all the time. Quite significant strokes, but if the general brain is healthy, you rewire very well. But you got an Alzheimer's brain and you get cell death, boy, that's a tough road to go. I mean, you've got to really reverse the underlying process, right? So obviously you want to catch this early.
Yeah, sure. I guess what I'm asking is, and I mean, I think you answered it, is that given at least what we think we understand about how lithium's probably working here, it's going to be much more effective prior to significant neuron loss.
I'm not quibbling. I'm not, right? But I think, again, this talks about this concept of a spectrum rather than a hard endpoint, right? We just want to fix the underlying problem, right? If people are having stress markers leaking out of their brain into their blood more than the 5 percentile, that's a problem, right? That's a problem, okay? Do I see a reasonable group of people try lithium and they're on lithium and they sure feel better? And they tell you right away. They'll say, I'm thinking clearer, I handle stress better, and they don't have bipolar. These are not bipolar patients, right? But they're on lithium. They said, it's health span rather than necessarily lifespan, right? And is something like the ATN a marker of somebody who is like, yeah, maybe you should try a little bit of lithium and see whether you just feel better. Now, if the markers reverse, that's a plus.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. But we haven't had time yet to do the kind of studies that say, well, what if they just stop? That's still a plus, right? If you don't get cell death and they don't progress and you're feeling better on a drug that costs $40 a year that's been used for more than 100 years, my God, that's a win, right? And that's what the Harvard paper is telling us, that there may be a $20 bill that's just on the ground that anybody can pick up who has some reasonable degree of medical skill. And, I think when you and I talked a year ago, I read in your voice or whatever, like, oh, this is kind of an unusual claim that lithium is potentially one of the best anti-aging drugs, right? And I think things have changed.
Certainly for Alzheimer's. I mean, we should talk about the anti-aging potential effects of lithium as well. Alzheimer's is one age-related disease, but I think there's reason to think lithium can go beyond Alzheimer's. Although, again, if we look specifically at the Nature paper, at least the mechanism they propose seems to be very specific for Alzheimer's disease in the sense of amyloid depleting lithium in specific brain regions. Again, could be a lot more going on than what they proposed in that paper, but that was the mechanism that they landed on.
Yeah, there's a part of that. Let's see, there were some areas that made me a little uncomfortable with that paper. Okay. I think the couple things really bothered me about that paper. I mean, number one, when you looked at their pathway analysis in their supplement, they talked a lot about the Wnt pathway or the wingless pathway, which implies that when you block glycogen synthase kinase 3 beta, which is a downstream product of TORC2, you're making cells less differentiated. Okay. I think that fits with a lot of what we know in terms of how lithium works in bipolar patients, that it de-differentiates the astroglia in bipolar patients. So it becomes a speed governor on excitatory nerve cells, but really in terms of the carburetor, the astroglia, rather than a brake, as if you were using an antipsychotic or a seizure drug. the other major pathway was autophagy. Autophagy was massively upregulated with lithium, and they don't even mention that in the paper. And I thought, that's really strange, because autophagy is everybody's, it's like motherhood, right? Everybody's into autophagy, and then they left it out of the paper. I don't get that.
Well, maybe they'll watch the podcast and respond.
Well,
in the
no.
comments.
I mean, it's a lot. I mean, when you do multi-omics, which they did, it's really hard to see the forest for the trees.
And I mean, oftentimes the reality is, to get your paper into a top tier journal like Nature or Science, you really do have to pick one relatively simple story and stick to it.
Yeah, and the editors sort of lead you.
Reviewers, I mean, it's the pattern, right? And so that's sort of what I was getting at, which is that I think there's a lot going on with lithium. I think this model of amyloid beta depleting lithium in specific brain regions makes sense. It fits the data, but there's probably a lot more.
I think there's more to it, in the sense that, you see 50% of Alzheimer's genes are microglia, right? But I'm not sure that's the proximal cause. I think the proximal cause is the excitatory nerve cells, like you and I have talked about before with the ND4 mice. That's the most bioenergetic portion of the brain.
I just had a really interesting podcast conversation with Corey Funk from Institute for Systems Biology. I don't know if you know Corey, but they're doing a lot of work as well on cholesterol metabolism and membrane fluidity as being a key driver of at least early components of Alzheimer's disease as well. So yes, I think that's right. And the data on lithium impacting age-related processes independent of Alzheimer's disease is also pretty interesting. So there could be multiple mechanisms at play here that are...
It's a TORC2. It's a downstream TORC2 inhibitor, right? It's going to affect every cell in the body.
Sure, in different ways, right? That's what I'm getting at. There could be multiple ways that...
Why would we just focus on microglia? I mean, I'm not sure that makes sense. Now, we have it. I want to jump in. I hope you don't mind. We have another technology that's out, that's commercially available, that supplements the lithium story. So we can now get a commercial RNA mixed myeloid lymphoid assay of about 400 to 500 species. And the assay, so you generate a vector of, RNA abundance in blood. And the company has a very deep phenotype matrix, that they've gathered over 5 to 10 years, 2,000 to 3,000 people. And so now, and what they're seeing is a really large signal for lithium in a variety of psychiatric conditions, and also, again, in the aging area as well. So we were stuck with proteomics that had low dimensionality, right? Which is amyloid and tau and NFL. And now we get to blow up the dimensionality a little bit more, and it's a large enough dimensionality you can do gene set enrichment. And I mean, oh my God, it's like the Hubble telescope, and it's $2,000.
So this is data from a variety of individuals, some of whom have been taking lithium. Is that what you mean?
No. So let me go over the protocol. Okay, so this was a group out of Indiana that followed, let's say, 2,000 people. Okay, and they did serial microRNA estimates in these patients. And they looked at things like suicide attempts and memory loss with age, and divergence from biological age versus, the aging clock stuff, simple stuff. Hospitalization for bipolar disorder, chronic pain, measures, ER visits for chronic pain. And now they have an AI. I mean, they literally have a large enough data set that you can start to do cluster analysis, and you can cluster phenotypes, which is great, right? But you can also break the AI and look at each RNA species and say, hey, what drugs out of the 2,200 FDA-approved drugs are going to move this vector towards the origin, right? And, I've done about 20 of these so far. And, what just comes up over and over and over again is lithium, right?
So this is a prediction based on what we know about lithium that it would move the gene expression profile in the direction
Of health,
of health. Okay.
right? And then I'm going technical, but, I think this, if you really look at the AI and you think carefully about what they're showing, I think what they're showing is that there's a group of humans that have gain of function in TORC2. I mean, we're all sort of comfortable with that.
That's interesting.
We're really comfortable with that in the rapamycin world. Yeah. Like, oh yeah, there's a whole bunch of diseases, where TORC1 is upregulated, mitochondrial disorders and gain of function in TORC1. But I'm looking at this data and say, oh yeah, there's a TORC2 gain of function that is part of the human condition, and lithium is a targeted drug across so many phenotypes because we really are hitting source code.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and as you know, a lot less has been done on TORC2 compared to TORC1 in terms of understanding the biology of that complex. We know a lot more now than we did a few years ago, but still far less than how we understand.
Oh yeah, I was at the aging conference and I was talking to some people about it. Hey, I need to know more about TORC2, and they said, "Oh, John, you should go to a Gordon conference." And I'm like, I'm a psychiatrist seeing patients. I wish. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back kind of big picture with Alzheimer's disease. And I'm just going to ask you to obviously speculate, but best case scenario for lithium, how much do you think it will move the needle for Alzheimer's disease? Are we talking a year, 5 years, complete cure? I mean, and again, I know it's speculation, but what's your best guess?
I think thinking in aggregates is just so dangerous. I have no doubt there's someone out there on lithium who is going to live 10 years longer because they're on lithium.
And is that somebody
I have no doubt
with Alzheimer's disease or because it's slowing aging?
Again, remember, TORC2 it's a TORC2 gain of function,
okay,
right? And you downregulate TORC2 and the cells don't go into senescence as quickly and they die more cleanly. They die with apoptosis rather than screaming head on the spike, because they're overregulated. I think most psychiatrists, I think if you really look granularly in the psychiatry literature, you would see this data that there are certain bipolar patients you put on lithium and their lifespan goes up a lot. Not even their health span, but just the brain works better.
Yeah.
They exercise more, they drive more safely. It's not suicide attempts. It's just the brain acts on the environment and they have a brain that works, right? Are there people that lithium has absolutely nothing to do with Alzheimer's? 100%.
Sure.
Right? I mean, I have some people that have markers and I give them this psychiatrically, therapeutically, homeopathic dose, 75 milligrams, and that's all they can tolerate. Now they're still better, right? But it's not anywhere near the typical psychiatric dosing. I mean, I just can't say it hard enough. There isn't a right dose and a right drug for aggregate populations. I mean, this is what you're doing at Aura Biomedical, is saying, look, it's not one drug.
Right.
It's a unique cocktail for each individual person.
Right.
Right.
And do you think in the case of Alzheimer's, that's because Alzheimer's is a collection of many different diseases and lithium only works for some of them, or at least the cause related to mTORC2 is different in different people?
I think what it is that I'm trying to see if I can phrase this in the right way. And if I may even be deluding myself, right? A patient with Alzheimer's disease is in a complicated n-dimensional biochemical space. Okay. That space is not linear. It has ridges and valleys, and none of our drugs are moving patients to the origin in a linear way. We're in this very complicated nonlinear world. And so it's not that it's a collection of diseases, it's that our tools are not linear tools. And when we combine them, we may be in a nonlinear world, which I think biologists have to get their head around. And I think the AI people understand that better than biologists do. In fact, I know they do, right? The AI guys are like, hey, look, if I don't design my Grok or my ChatGPT somewhere, I'm going to hallucinate. Whereas in biology, even the best people are just doing multivariate discriminant analysis, and they just assume linearity. Yeah. And that's a mistake. And I think it's going to bite a lot of patients if we don't at least know going in ahead of time that our multivariate models are going to hallucinate, related to this nonlinearity. And I bet you guys see that in C. elegans to some degree. And that would be an interesting conversation in its own right. Yeah.
What about side effects? So, I think lithium scares a lot of people. Yeah. And what are your thoughts there in terms of how concerned should people be? Thyroid, kidney, at the doses that might be effective for Alzheimer's.
Okay, so let's talk about clinically who does poorly with lithium.
And what does it mean to do poorly?
Okay, do poorly. So there was a study in the early 70s looking at lithium and temporal lobe epilepsy, and they had to stop the study because patients became too sick. And so there is a seizure model of lithium and pilocarpine exposure in rats where you can cause seizures, right? And so in the temporal lobe epileptics, if you drive growth, you push toward the TORC1 distribution, right? You de-differentiate cells. Do you drive the excessive cell growth in mesial temporal sclerosis and the temporal lobe epilepsy syndromes, right? And so, there's a problem de-differentiating cells in some patients that is related to this very broad, the phenotypic lines are not clear, which is excessive nerve biogenesis, right? So you see this in the amateurs, and I mean this as a way just to slap someone out of this idea, right? Like, oh, it causes neurogenesis. That's a good thing, right? That's really a dumb comment, right? I mean, nerve cells are post-mitotic for a reason, right? And there's only a few areas of the brain that have new nerve cells, the temporal lobe and the olfactory bulb, and those are the most epileptogenic regions in the brain. And it's not always obvious that you want to grow new nerve cells, right? That's a problem in some people. And it can take months for seizure-like events for lithium to develop. And it takes a lot of technical skill to pick that up.
How frequent is that in people, would you say? And these are high doses, right? Do we have any data on the lower doses of lithium? And
well, again, it's a dimension, right? And the phenotypes are subtle, right? So, I once had a guy, he was in the prison, he was on lithium, and he was getting a great response to it. And he says, John, my nose is dripping on one side, and I feel a little confused. And I was like, shit. And it turns out that in temporal lobe epilepsy monitoring units, when someone's having a seizure, you get neurogenic rhinorrhea on one side, ipsilateral to the seizure, and you can tell which side the seizure's on by just which side of the nose the patient wipes their nose, right? So temporal lobe epilepsy is a problem, this issue of excessive neurogenesis.
But again, is that going to be primarily at the high psychiatric doses?
We don't know.
Okay.
Right? It's a continuum, right? The other issue is in the migraine patients. So lithium with migraine is really tough, right? And we had a real, just a fantastic migraine specialist who's retired since now, who was just like, "Oh, John, please never give my patients lithium," because not always, but often you make migraine worse. Okay, and what's the cause of that? Is that dedifferentiation of the astroglia? So you have problems with fuel supply to the brain. Is it excessive autophagy? That's another interesting article because there is some cellular data that suggests that mitophagy and autophagy are distinct. And if you get too much autophagy, you drop the mitochondria below this energetic threshold. And that may be one of the lithium toxicities that happens. So those are the two, very clear. You got to be really careful with those syndromes. But migraine is 25% of women have migraine, right? 1% of the population has epilepsy. 10% of the population will have an epileptic seizure at some point in their life, right? I mean,
I didn't realize it was that high.
it's high,
Yeah.
right? And, what if it takes 4 or 5 years for you're just on the wrong gradient, right? And
So based on that, do you have concerns with the fact that people are going out and buying lithium on Amazon and taking it based on this Nature paper? Or do you think that the doses are low enough, most people are not going to experience these kinds of side effects?
I think people have concerns implies that I have some I don't want to have judgment on anybody, right? This is an illness that's going to kill a lot of people and it's going to steal a lot of joy. And you can't find a specialist because the waiting list is 2 years. And there aren't a lot of people like me, right? I mean, I think we have to let 1,000 flowers bloom and just do our best to have everybody work together and exchange information and try to learn in a logical way.
So let me maybe frame it a different way: is if people want to start taking lithium based on what they've heard and the latest research, what should they be paying attention to as potential side effects that might be worth watching? Let's assume they don't have access to you or somebody with your experience who can give them medical care. They're buying it on Amazon.
They're buying on Amazon.
What should they pay attention to?
Right. We're in a desert. We're in a specialist desert, and people have to make their own decisions because they don't have a choice. Right. England makes it illegal. Yeah, crazy stuff, right? I think what we see in psychiatry people that have bipolar disorder is you increase the dose until the risk becomes greater than the benefit. Okay. In general, the more lithium, this is well known, fewer hospitalizations, fewer suicide attempts, less mood swings. But once you get a blood level higher than 0.7 in a population of bipolar patients, right? Now, they're not average, right? They have upregulated TORC2, right? But the cut point is around 0.7 where you start getting tremor, okay? You start getting decreased urine concentration. You start getting a brain fog, which is different than Alzheimer's, just sort of a fuzziness. Low-grade migraine symptoms are very common, just sort of like photosensitive and kind of this soft cephalic pressure, maybe a little nausea, that's kind of chronic daily headache. It's not migraine, but it's definitely like, oh, that's lithium-induced migraine.
Got it.
Right. In terms of thyroid, well, lithium is a blocker of the final step of adding iodine to the thyroxine molecule. So it's a synthetic block. It doesn't damage your thyroid. You just add thyroid back in. right? And a medical student can do that. That's not difficult. Yeah, this is a trivial. I mean, it's a real side effect, but it's not difficult to treat. The kidney issue is probably, again, the wet roads cause rain story, where the rates of spontaneous kidney failure in bipolar patients are elevated. And when you stratify kidney failure in bipolar patients, lithium doesn't have a higher rate of kidney failure than antipsychotics or, I mean, this is classic age-related kidney failure, right? Which actually correlates very highly in community samples with neurofilament light, which is super interesting. And that's a $20 bill where we need to get our nephrologists in touch with our neurologists and really look at that population carefully.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And directionality there could go either way or both ways, right?
Yeah, both ways, right? I'm assuming it's a shared causality.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Okay. So no, that's very good. And I think that gives people some ideas of symptoms they should pay attention to if they are taking lithium. Again, presumably people are going to be taking a lower dose than what a bipolar patient
I mean, what do I think is reasonable? I think it's reasonable if you have a primary care doc who has been managing illness for 20 or 30 years and has a generalist intuition, and you want to work with a primary care doc. There's nobody else out there. You don't really have any choices.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think anyone has the moral authority to say, oh, you shouldn't do this. Right. But you want to have, again, some sort of experienced sage of ice, who can just say, hey, maybe you're pushing this a little too hard. Yeah.
All right. Anything we haven't talked about with lithium that you want to dive into before we shift gears to rapamycin?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, yeah. Great. So I want to talk about this chronic fatigue rapamycin connection. I know you're a co-author on I don't think it's been peer review published yet, but it's in.
It's in.
Okay,
Yeah, I just got an email about the proofs 2 days ago.
Great. So this first came across my radar as a preprint, and my recollection of this study, and obviously I'd like you to tell me the details because you were involved in the study. The take home, though, being that in a population of people with chronic fatigue syndrome who were being given rapamycin off label, a significant fraction, something like 75% of them showed improvements in symptomology, which is striking. And that seemed to be enriched for people whose chronic fatigue was associated with a prior viral infection, which I also think is pretty interesting given rapamycin's connection to antiviral gene expression and chronic inflammation. And then the other part of the paper that I thought was interesting was what was not seen, which was changes in glucose, insulin, lipids, which are side effects that people talk a lot about with rapamycin, but that typically I think the data don't actually show as being at least significant side effects across a population. So does that fit with kind of your recollection of the paper?
This is a great jumping off point.
And if not, where did I get wrong?
This paper is really a great paper because the core argument is 100% true, right? There's a group of individuals who have a hyperinflammatory response, okay, to foreign RNA or DNA, okay? It doesn't matter whether it's COVID. It doesn't matter whether it's flu. It doesn't matter whether it's Moderna or Pfizer, right? It doesn't matter whether it's a defect in the laminar nuclear membrane A, which I think you published on years ago, right? Too much DNA and RNA, when exposed to certain individuals, activates the STING pathway and other pathways, and you get a hyperinflammatory response.
Yep. And let me just clarify, make sure I understood you correctly. When you said it doesn't matter if it's Moderna or Pfizer, some of these people can be responding to the vaccine itself.
It's the RNA.
Rather than the virus that the vaccine is protecting against, right? Which is why, again, I don't think neither one of us are anti-vax, right? Vaccines work for what they're designed to do.
Well, I mean, it's a political statement. I mean, I don't give a shit, right?
But I mean, let's be clear. Vaccines usually work for what they're designed to do, and they can, in some people, as you said, have unanticipated hyperinflammatory consequences. And I just want to make sure that I understood you correctly, that the vaccine itself could, in some cases, be the cause of the inflammatory.
Again, it's referral bias, right? What you see as a clinician depends on the patients you see, right? Sure. So if you're a pediatrician, to some degree, kids don't die, and you see a lot of ear infections. Okay.
Yes.
If you're a primary care doc in today's world, you see a lot of type 2 diabetes. Okay. If you're a psychiatrist who has an interest in treatment-resistant depression and chronic pain, I saw a lot of vaccine injury. Okay. Fair. And that doesn't mean that I want to write public policy, right?
Right.
I'm not about that, right?
Right. No. And again, I wasn't even like, I don't want to suggest that people should not get vaccinated for the things where vaccines are quite useful. And I'm just trying to make sure, first of all, I understand your take on the biology, and that we are being clear with the variety of things that can cause these types of hyperinflammatory consequences.
Yeah, it's looking like, I mean, again, we're being as general as we possibly can. There's a group of patients maybe that have a gain of function in TORC1, and as part of the phenotype, they're hyperinflammatory, right? When they are exposed to things that activate the innate immune system.
Right. And also probably worth saying, it doesn't even have to be viral in nature, right? I think it could be bacterial from the gut. It could be mitochondrial damage.
It could be mitochondrial leakage from it could be a defect in the nuclear membrane, and you're having DNA leaking out into the cytosol.
So there are multiple causes of this inflammatory response. The thing I hadn't though appreciated before reading this paper is in chronic fatigue, the high fraction of people whose chronic fatigue can be associated at least with some sort of severe viral infection preceding it.
Yes. And so this, I think, is this terribly interesting question, which is, what are the death components in lymphoid cells and myeloid cells? In other words, you have an infection, a cell becomes activated, right? And then there should be a dampening of the inflammatory response that turns off the effector components in the lymphoid compartment, and maybe to some degree in the myeloid compartment. And so what are those dampening components? One of them is a global signal, which is steroid from the adrenals, right? And everybody knows, I mean, took us too long to figure this out in COVID. If you're an 85-year-old and you get COVID, after 2 to 3 days, you need a round of steroids, because you're not dying from COVID, you're dying from the hyperinflammatory response. And every internist in the world knows this, that, you have a patient who's septic, you need to give them steroids sometimes. Otherwise, their blood pressure goes to zero and they die, right? So steroids are one of the things that turn off the hyperinflammatory immune system. The other thing that turns off the hyperinflammatory immune system is the T regulatory lymphocyte. And rapamycin massively upregulates Tregs relative to the effector cells. And this has been seen in essentially every autoimmune study that's ever looked at. Maybe less so in neurological disorders that are related to mitochondrial metabolism, because the Tregs use mitochondrial metabolism rather than glycolysis, right? And so, are we looking at not so much of a defect in steroid production, although we could be, but are we looking at a defect in gain of function in terms of too much effector cell relative to the Treg? And the Treg is a TORC2 cell. It's hyperspecialized, right? And so you're stuck in this TORC1 world, and you need to go get shoved into the specialized world, which downregulates the inflammatory response, right? And so this has been seen in lupus, right? When you use rapamycin in lupus, and one of the causes of lupus is just constant DNA exposure to the STING pathway in the cytosol, right? You can see remarkable improvement in lupus, right? So, what did they say? Well, I mean, what is this study saying to us? I mean, just very simply, they're saying we're looking at people that look inflamed, right? That's it. And the etiology in this case, they're kind of easy to pick out because they're stair-step drop of function. Somewhat normal, they get a virus, they never recover, right? Do they have clonal selection for effector T cells and effector myeloid cells that are sort of persisting in a sort of a benign cancerous state? And if we pulse with rapamycin, or if we give rapamycin, can we change the equilibrium distribution from an effector immune state to a tolerant immune state? That's really not a very ambitious hypothesis when you really think about it.
Right.
It's like kind of like, well, yeah, no shit, right? And it's kind of crazy that it's taken this long for this study to be done.
Yeah.
Right. And so what did they say? They saw this whole broad phenotype get better. Fatigue got better. Pain got better. Non-refreshing sleep got better. Orthostatic intolerance got better. And it got better at a very low dose. And I want to come back to that because that's really important. And that's one of the flaws of the study is the dosing. The dosing is flawed. Okay. And when they looked at biomarkers, and they didn't have any money. I mean, I talked with the PI quite a bit, and, he's like startup central.
Well, again, this is the problem with why we don't have more data on rapamycin at this point is that no company is going to invest in it. Right. Well, I shouldn't say no company, but few are. And for whatever reason, grant funders haven't prioritized these kinds of studies.
Well, I think I'm trying to be fair to the grant funder because I think I know who it is. It's just, do you write a little check or a big check? You don't know. You don't know your people.
Yeah. You
have to give them a startup project and show whether they can deliver before you write a big check. Right. So I'm gonna put it maybe in that way.
Maybe, although I would suggest the data on, again, the individuals doing the study, sure. The data on rapamycin is so deep and so broad that there is no question that these kinds of studies should be funded.
Oh, 100%.
In my view.
And I have all sorts of ideas, and I could talk forever, but they're probably good ideas. So
yeah, you and I are alike in that way. We come up with all sorts of good ideas.
Well, no, but I
never get funded.
No, I know, I get it. But see, the difference is we're not just reading papers. I mean, you've done your animal work, and I've done my human work. Yeah. I mean, we don't care about the guidelines anymore because we know that they're based on nothing, right? So let's keep going on this. So one of the things that they showed is that serum markers of autophagy tended to correlate with response. Okay. And again, I think that speaks to the limitations of their funding, right? They didn't have money to look at a lot of biomarkers. They looked at one marker, which is autophagy, and they said, hey, look, when you increase autophagy in blood, right, people tend to get better, right? And then, again, throwing us backward to the Nature paper with lithium, that autophagy story.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and it would be interesting, again, if you want to speculate, would lithium work in this context?
Lithium never works in this context.
Interesting.
Never.
Why?
I'm just saying,
observationally.
And this is my experience over the last 30 years, for whatever it's worth, right? Lithium doesn't reverse pain in the chronic pain patient. Okay. It may help with the agitation or the anxiety.
Yeah.
But I've never seen it work.
Brain versus...
Remember, it makes migraine worse.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Okay.
Right?
All right.
And, and again, obviously there's edge cases, right? But psychiatrists don't prescribe lithium for pain. Okay. And rheumatologists don't prescribe lithium for pain. It just doesn't seem to work. Right.
Okay. There's interesting biology there. We don't understand.
There's some clues here that are worth looking at.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, so that's all the money they had was to look at autophagy. right? And then again, I want to go back to this concept of locality, right? So whenever you do blood work, you're looking at non-local. How much of it are you actually looking at the underlying disease process, right? I mean, blood is coming like Athena, fresh out of the Zeus's head, right? Glowing and sparkling with beautiful armor, right out of the bone marrow. It's not really in a Torsi-2 world. It's almost a stem cell, right? So only a small fraction of the cells in the blood should actually be differentiated. Most of them are in stem mode. And so when you do these sorts of omnibus sort of metabolomics in blood, how much is that representing the local tissue that you're really interested in? Well, for you, it's obvious, but it isn't for a lot of...
Do we know in chronic fatigue what the local tissue is that you would want to look at?
Biology is like one giant conversation, right? There's myokines from the muscle that are talking to the brain and to the liver, and it's just one big web.
This particular condition, I think, it's hard to know where. If you had all the money in the world, it's non-obvious to me where you would specifically look. Obviously, you could do a lot more in terms of biomarkers and assessments, and you could do much deeper immune phenotype.
Other than the immune aging hypothesis, which I think all of us kind of in the area like, there's something to this.
Yeah, right.
The immune cells are particularly sensitive, right? Yeah. And that seems to be the case.
So let's talk about dose, because you said the dosing was flawed in this study. What did you mean by that?
Okay. So I want to make an argument to the agent community, okay, to get out of their silo a little bit. Okay. We have this amazing amount of data that we got with death and pain and blood and suffering, which is, what is the dose of rapamycin that is necessary to prevent graft versus host disease?
Sure.
Right?
Yep.
And that information didn't come for free. This has been a lot of hard work with patients and doctors over the last 10 to 20 years, right? And if you look at the population estimates of what it takes to prevent graft versus host disease, it ranges between 3 to 20 nanograms per ml, right?
That's trough levels, right?
Yeah. Well, it's a long half-life, so yeah, whatever, but it's a lot, right? So let's think about what is graft versus host disease. Okay. Let's say you have leukemia and someone kills your bone marrow with radiation and a cytotoxic drug, and they give you somebody else's bone marrow, and that bone marrow is going to kill you because it looks as your body as a cancer, as a virus, or DNA that should be killed.
Sure.
Right? And transplant doctors have learned that you can't control this graft versus host disease with low doses of rapamycin. You often need high doses. You often need another drug.
Right? They're almost always, I believe, taking other drugs in addition to rapamycin.
We should talk. We don't have time, but we'll talk about Tregs more. Maybe not at this time, right? But they've learned that there's a distribution of hyperinflammatory response in the population that is defined by the dose level of 3 to 20. We know this. That's the population distribution. Right? And so most of these aging studies are done with 1 milligram a day that is not representative of the population hyperinflammatory Gaussian distribution.
Yeah. So let me, I don't know if pushback is the right word. Let me comment. So first of all, most of the aging studies, I would say, there aren't very many to begin with in humans. And they either fall into one of two camps, right? They either do the 1 milligram a day, which to me is a dumb dose for a variety of reasons, or they do something like 6 milligrams a week, which is, I think, what was done in this study, if I remember correctly.
They were nice to me. I said, I don't want to do pulsing. I did once a day, but I think the rest of the people did 6.
6 milligrams
6
once
pulsing.
a week.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's a reason for that in the aging literature, and that's Joan's work with vaccine response. I know you know that. All of that's just to say there is some rationale for that once a week dosing. But the point I wanted to make is, I think the use of rapamycin for something like, let's just say, health span extension, right, in people who are not chronically ill, and we could debate whether aging is a chronic illness, but let's just leave for now. They don't have a existing chronic disease.
Right.
The risk tolerance, of course, is going to be much lower than in somebody whose quality of life is dramatically impaired by something like chronic fatigue syndrome, or who's going to die if they don't get an organ transplant rejection. So there is a pragmatic piece here, right, to the dosing.
I understand that. I understand that. And this is not meant to criticize the aging people. What I'm trying to say is that these lines between the totally healthy, very rich, high IQ person, I mean, these are not random. The people that are taking Rapa off-label are not normal people. Okay? They're TORC2 upregulated.
Interesting.
I mean, I know this.
Okay.
Right? Biology, behavior is not random. You see amazing referral bias.
Sure. I mean, I would agree with that. I'm interested to know why you say they're TORC2 upregulated.
They have a high IQ.
Yeah.
Right? And in order to have a high IQ, you must upregulate TORC2.
Okay. This is we definitely should have a conversation about that. I'm intrigued.
Yeah. But I think the point that I'm making is that we're all just scrambling for clues about how to use rapamycin at the right dose for the right patient.
I agree. And lack of biomarkers is one of the challenges among many that we have with rapamycin.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do we see in the transplant world? What we see in the transplant world is that in order to keep people from getting graft versus host disease, you need to be running people 2, 3, 4 milligrams, with other agents.
Right.
Okay. Daily.
Yes.
Right. And that's because they have a foreign bone marrow that will kill them. Right. If you have an autoimmune disease, you have a foreign bone marrow that will kill you. Right. You have a subpopulation of a myeloid or a lymphoid population that thinks you are the cancer rather than yourself.
Yeah.
Right. So the mapping between graft versus host disease and classical autoimmune disease is much tighter than these categories suggest.
Yeah, and that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, right? And so when you have a very sick population, and these people are very sick, right, is 1 milligram, it's a pilot study, right? I get that, right? But is 1 milligram too low, right? And are we going to see better outcomes with dosages that are more typically used in hyperinflammatory syndromes?
Yeah.
And no one is doing this because the rheumatology world is entirely funded by very expensive biologics. They're $1,000 to $4,000 a month with lots of marketing, lots of junior faculty members writing guidelines, and professional societies that are co-opted by the pharma money.
Yeah. So let me also suggest that one of the reasons people aren't doing these kinds of studies is because I know when you go to FDA to get approval for your clinical trial, they will push back at using rapamycin at organ transplant doses because of their concerns about safety. I know this because I've been involved in clinical trials that have tried to do even lower doses,
I understand
right?
that.
So I mean, there are pragmatic reasons as well, which, right or wrong, I don't disagree with you. I think for certain conditions, organ transplant dosing is going to give a better efficacy signal than 1 meg a day or 6 megs.
Well, I know it's the case because I've seen it, right? I have people that simply don't respond at 1 milligram, and we'll get to the Joan Manick argument here in a second because it's important.
And the side effects go up. So again, this is all about balancing, right? Risk and reward.
Of course, right? Of course, right. But remember, the mortality rate in lupus is 25%.
Yeah. So condition matters, right? Use endpoint matters. I agree. Yes. I mean, I know you and I agree, but I just want to be clear about why it's not obvious that for everybody going to 4 mgs of rapamycin a day is the way to go, right?
Of course not, right? Of course not, right? Of course not. But, what happens, I think, sometimes is you get caught in the blinders of just like, well, I don't want to go higher than 1 milligram. And what are we seeing in general in the longevity literature?
6 mgs a week
Or,
in people.
that dose generally.
Yeah.
It's pretty safe. We're not seeing
I agree.
We're not seeing a lot of problem.
And yet, if you try to do a clinical trial of rapamycin at 6 mgs per week, FDA is going to want you to do a dose escalation where you start at 1 mg a week, 2 mgs a week, 4 mgs a week. I know, because John On had to do this. As stupid as that sounds, right?
Yeah, it's ridiculous, right? It really is ridiculous. And there's a couple of branch points from that. I mean, number one, in the world of small molecules and rapid development, the FDA is gone. Does it die in 5 years? Does it die in 10 years? Does it die in 15 years? It can't live in the world of multivariate biochemical space. It just can't. We're going to have an AI. I'm using an AI right now. I mean, literally, I have an AI that says you should use these combination of drugs. I mean, it's a terrible AI. It's got problems, right? I mean, and that's no criticism of the founders, right? It's hard, right? But once we have an AI where patients are located in an n-dimensional space, what do we need the FDA for? They're useless. They don't help us. Yeah. They have no value, right? And we want to invent a tool so we don't need the FDA, right? And that's why we must, I mean, I'll just keep preaching this. If we don't get rapidly into the multivariate world, we're going to be stuck with these ridiculous FDA guidance that, and we can't do it.
I don't want to get too far down a rabbit hole on FDA. I guess I'm not quite so confident that FDA is not serving a useful, or couldn't serve a useful purpose in that world. And that we don't need somebody to create guardrails on companies, entities that want to develop new medications, but may be more motivated by profit than by safety, right? Well, which is just a reality.
I think the idea of regressing on a point is really the fundamental FDA flaw, right? You have an indication, you have lupus or you don't. You have high blood sugar or you don't, right? Yeah.
But that could change. Like, again, I think we could see changes in the way that clinical trials are designed, run, integration with AI tools, biomarkers that can be used as surrogate endpoint. We already see this happening in certain conditions.
Yeah, they got a long way to go.
So I agree. No. I mean, you and I think are mostly in alignment here. And I don't see a future, maybe it'll happen. I don't see a future where, we just allow anybody to bring any drug to market and start, making claims and selling it to people without safety.
So you have to have, no, I get it. There's always got to be a credentialing mechanism, right? 100%, right?
And maybe it's not FDA, maybe it's something
I think
else.
Something will replace the FDA that is more intellectually fluid.
That should happen regardless of whether it happens within FDA or as a
right. I mean, it's just the conceptual model is dead.
Yes. I think it needs to change for sure.
Yeah,
I both agree with that.
Okay, so let's talk about the TOR1, TORC2 pulse versus non-pulse data.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was listening to Joan give her talk about the virus in some rapamycin series, and she said, we just need a pure TORC1 inhibitor because we don't want this off-label toxicity.
And maybe worth just so everybody who's not a rapamycin aficionado knows what we're talking about. So Joan's model, and I mean, I think the data more or less back this up, is that chronic inhibition of mTOR complex 1, which is what high dose daily rapamycin will do, leads to indirect effects on mTOR complex 2. And the model there, so that's all true. I think that's been seen in multiple studies. We saw that in our mouse models, at least in the brain. The model from that, though, is that it's these off-target effects on mTOR complex 2 that lead to all of the negative side effects associated with.
Well, right. But she said something that I thought was really kind of amusing from my end, which is she said, and if it gets high enough, you start inhibiting PI3 kinase. And I'm not sure I understand why that would make any difference, to some degree, maybe. But
yeah, which is interesting as well, because RTB101, the drug that they ended up using in this is Restore Bio now, in their pivotal phase 3, is a dual kinase inhibitor. So they picked a drug.
Yeah, exactly. So what do you
sorry, Joan.
so what do you see clinically? Okay. So I have a rough estimate of PI3 kinase gain of function. Okay. Which is the insulin level divided by the BMI. The insulin level divided by the BMI. So this has been seen in people that have PI3 kinase.
So it is a phenotype that you see in people who have gain of function PI3
yeah,
kinase.
It's insulin sensitivity. How much bang for buck do you get for your insulin? Right. So you have this very low insulin level and you have a very high BMI.
And maybe this is getting too granular, but does body composition matter or is it just BMI at this point?
My guess is they tend to, well, I'm not going to go into it. I haven't studied this enough, but I have this data, that I'm ready to put in an AI model whenever I can get the funds, right? So we have a rough estimate of PI3.
So large people who have low insulin levels.
Yes.
Okay.
But it doesn't have to be large. That's interesting. Yeah, there's some play in this that's really interesting, I think, in terms of developmental, when does steroid turn on and off, this kind of stuff. I mean, that's its own thing.
Well, and in genetic PI3K activation, you're going to have that developmental effect, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's good stuff here, right? So let's say we have a population that's got a PI3 gain of function, okay, and they're insulin sensitive, right? And they have autoimmune disease, okay, and they may have autistic traits. I know that exists. I have it. I have a cluster of those people, right? You give them rapa, their sugars don't move at all. Zero. You don't see changes in triglycerides. You don't see changes. You may see a little bit of insulin. You may see a trace of glucose, but they're on 4 milligrams of rapamycin. You don't see anything.
Interesting. Okay.
Right. You have other people you put on 1 milligram of rap. I have a guy I just talked to last week. He's like, oh, I really liked the way I felt on it, but my sugars went up 30 or 40 points. 1 milligram. Right.
Yeah.
So, are there people who need a dual kinase inhibitor? And the search for the holy grail of the pure TORC1 is perhaps a distraction.
Yeah. I mean, again, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I've certainly said many times over the years that while it's a nice model, that we don't really know that this idea that all the good stuff comes from TORC1 inhibition and all the bad stuff comes from off-target effects on TORC2. Obviously, that's too simplistic anyways, but it's going to be very individual, which I think is what you're getting at.
Right. I mean, there's data in PI3 kinase mice use interfering RNA for TORC2. You treat the autism and the epilepsy. So you may, I mean, again, this is dose, rapa, right? We need a lot more thought about this. There may be people that need 3 to 4 milligrams, not because you're trying to hit TORC1, you're trying to hit TORC2. And I inhibit TORC2 all the time. I've been inhibiting TORC2 for 30 years, right? Because I use lithium and I use high dose tamoxifen, right? And tamoxifen is a PKC inhibitor, right? And we do this all the time. And we're comfortable. We love it. We have patients that love us. They're happy with us, right? And is rapamycin, I think from my end, what I'm interested in is rapamycin going to be a mood stabilizer? Right. In the treatment refractory bipolar patient.
And what's your gut feeling?
I have people that, I mean, 30 years of depression, they're like, I'm on rapa, I'm 70% better. Yeah. Right. And how often does that happen? Not often enough, I want to generalize. But I think you saw it in your paper as well.
Yeah, we definitely had a signal. I mean,
there were some people like, oh my God, it's not just fatigue. Yeah. It's not just pain. It's like, I'm not suicidal anymore. And I'm really excited about life.
Right. So let's come back to the paper for a minute, because I want to understand a little bit better what the structure here was and what your role was. So some of the patients in this paper were your patients, right?
I think I had about 20. Okay. And I think, they were, Simran was nice enough to give me a readout just of my group. So I have my group that I have my own private data that's not published. Okay. and then I have the aggregate data.
Right. And are you able to share? Are you willing to share?
Yeah, I don't care.
How did your group differ from the rest? So dosing was different, it sounds like.
Yeah, I as a psychiatrist, I just live in this world of human frailty, and I can't stand asking people to dose once a week, because it's just, people are creatures of habit. Just dose every day, right? It just keep things simple, right? It's too many meds, right? So I just said, hey, look, guys, will you let me dose once a day? They said, sure, no problem. So I'm dosing once a day.
And was the cumulative dose
about the same?
About the same.
It's close enough.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. What I heard from the PI, he says, your people look a little different. Their synuclein levels were different. And of course, that really got my attention, but I haven't heard anything more about it. Right. And I was like, please, can I have my synuclein levels? Please. Please. Yeah. It turns out synuclein's one of the predictors of alcoholism, which is its own interesting, one of the chief genetic risk factors for. We can go into that at some point.
And let me just tangent on that for a second. It's a predictor or it's a responder? Like, it's that
when
it's
you do genetic
gain
of function, it predicts alcoholism. Okay. Yeah, and that would be a podcast alone. Let's talk about synuclein, because that's a good topic. Anyway, so my people were 1 milligram a day, and I probably had a broader referral bias than they did, than the other members. The other members were probably very much like, oh yeah, I was really doing well. I got COVID, and I never recover. Right. Or I get infections and I'm always wiped out for 3 months. Right. That kind of stuff. My group was a little broader, because I was just looking more in sort of hyperinflammatory syndromes. Like, I think I had 2 or 3 people that were poisoned by PCBs, and they had activation of the aryl hydrocarbon receptor. And so you get all sorts of just very strange downstream immune activation. And, this is an area of huge litigation, and, you can't trust anybody because everybody's dirty, right? But they're like, nobody will treat them, right? And so I had some people in that, and, it was a broader group.
Okay. And the way this was designed, like the study had been funded, there were psychiatrists, medical doctors, I'm guessing.
Generally internists. I was probably the only psychiatrist.
Who agreed to participate.
Yeah.
And when somebody came in with chronic fatigue symptoms, they would be, if eligible, put on rapamycin for the study.
I think it was very simple. I mean, you meet the entrance criteria, and, I would just sort of send people and let them say, hey, is that close enough to the entrance criteria?
And was there a placebo group or everyone in the study?
Just everyone. Everyone got, around 1 milligram a day or 6 milligrams a week, that kind of stuff. And they were followed for 4 months, right? And, people who got benefit kept taking the drug. People that didn't get benefit dropped out. I think some people dropped out because they couldn't afford the lab work, or they couldn't afford the drug.
So the patients paid for the medication.
There was some,
and the lab work
there was some
out-of-pocket.
patient out-of-pocket expense, and that was a real problem.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, that's the world we live in with rapamycin, underfunded studies.
Underfunded studies, right? And I mean, I'm thinking, so I looked at my group, and in my group was about 20 people. I think at the end of 4 months, 4 to 5 were still taking it. So
okay, so it was a pretty small
number
percentage.
Needed to treat was 4, right? But that was at 1 milligram, right? I didn't
go higher.
I didn't go higher, and I mean, personally in medicine, if you can get a number needed to treat of 4 for a chronic illness that has no treatment, you're doing pretty good, right? So I'll give you an example of one of these guys that I'm seeing now. He says, I get a viral infection every 2 weeks. It always wipes me out. This has been my whole life. I've been on rapamycin. I think he's up to 2 or 3 milligrams now. He said, I haven't gotten a viral infection in 2 years. I mean, the Joan Manick story, just like writ large, right? I just don't get sick anymore. Right. He's still getting infected. I mean, we've been infected with viruses since the
He's just not having the
hyperinflammatory response. Right. Right.
Yeah.
And again, going back to COVID, which is really, it's just a fascinating, and COVID's been such a wonderful lesson for all of us. right? There was this
I'm
idea.
not sure everybody would agree it's been wonderful, but
Well,
I know what you mean.
it's if you're religious, God is chastising you and making you a better person, right? Chasing my soul. Um, but there was this issue like, oh, people didn't get in. There was a group of people that never got infected with COVID, right? Because they didn't have antibodies. I think some people looked and said, "No, no, their T cell response was so good. There was never enough. There was never enough innate immune activation to actually drive B cell antibody maturation."
Interesting. Yeah.
Right. So,
Yeah.
if your innate immune system is cooking with gas and your T cells are cooking with gas, this antibody testing may not even be relevant.
Right.
Right. And so, it's kind of cool to think about, being that wonderful person that never gets sick. Right. The immune system is so perfectly tuned. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I often look back at the whole Restore Bio timeline relative to COVID and just imagine how different the situation could have been, because they shut down that pivotal clinical trial in November 2019.
So I think another topic that we should really think about in the area is the issue of high-dose pulsed rapamycin.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about that. So what do you mean by high dose in this context?
Okay, so again, the transplant people are giving us lessons and we're not listening. Okay. So what they do when they give someone a bone marrow transplant is 3 to 4 days after a transplant, they give a high dose, I think, of cyclophosphamide, which is a DNA damaging agent, and it kills rapidly dividing cells. Okay, and those rapidly dividing cells are literally the T cells and B cells that are antigenically specific for the host, right? So they're kind of cleaning out the most dangerous part of the graft versus host disease. So there's this role of killing rapidly dividing immune cells when there is an injury, right? And you're clonally deleting these cells, right? You're making the stem cell population cleaner, right? And we know rapamycin can do that, right? But you think about what we do in medicine all the time. Someone comes in with migraine, back pain, rheumatoid arthritis flare, post-respiratory asthma. He'll give them 40 milligram pulse of prednisone 30-20-10 and just sort of crush the inflammation.
You're just trying to knock it down.
Right, but it may be more than just crushing the inflammation. Steroid causes apoptosis in certain lymphoid cells, right? And so the body naturally does clonal adverse selection for overly TORC1 growth cells that grow too much, have too much BICL2. They don't die the way they're supposed to. They just sit around, and you kind of have, if you will, a low-grade, multiple myeloma or lymphoma. You're just always kind of there with this clonally selected hyperinflammatory cell. And the body does this all the time with steroids.
Yeah.
You get a steroid pulse from the adrenals when you're infected. Okay. And everybody in medicine is comfortable with this. Medical students do this. Okay. Is there a role for a rapamycin pulse?
Yeah, that's interesting. So you're talking like a very high, I don't know about very high, a higher acute dose, right, one time maybe.
Yeah, one time.
Yeah.
Cause massive apoptosis.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, would it cause massive apoptosis?
I think, but there's this interest. Like I'm seeing women that are like going to get pregnant, right? And there's all this beautiful data on ova quality when you give pregnant pups rapamycin for a month or so. You clean out the bad eggs, right, and you leave the good
somehow
eggs.
You select. Yeah, right. I don't think we know the mechanism there. I mean, again, typically, and maybe it would be different with a high acute dose, right? Typically, rapamycin is not cytotoxic, right? It's cytostatic, and it will.
It's going to increase it may increase mitochondrial mitophagy.
Absolutely.
right? And so you're going to clear out some stuff. So
Kill out damage intracellular.
let's talk about an egg, right? An egg is just like full of mitochondria, right? It's just huge, right? Let's say you pulse a woman who wants to get pregnant with a high dose of rapamycin, and you're cleaning out heteroplasmy that shouldn't be there,
That's an interesting concept. Yeah.
right? And that wouldn't be that hard to do in terms of people who are doing IVF. You randomize some women who are getting IVF, and maybe they get 2 milligrams a day for a week, and then you have a control group, and then you do your standard embryos, and you just say, hey, what's my embryo quality look like?
So I mean, related, I'm going to see Yushin Su at Columbia in about a week, and she's involved with Zev Williams leading the rapamycin premature ovarian failure trial. So these are, in fact, women who would like to get pregnant and have premature ovarian failure. So I'll mention this idea to her. They're I believe doing 6 milligrams once a week or 4 milligrams once a week in their trial. And I haven't seen any data from that trial yet, but it's an interesting concept, right? That maybe a single acute dose or a single week of dosing would have a beneficial effect on egg quality.
I had a gal that came to me, and we did CSF metabolomics, and she had a marker for early Parkinson's disease that was like 7 Z-scores up. And I think family member had Parkinson's disease. And so she got on Rapa, and after 3 months, she said, oh yeah, I don't have any more, endometriosis. It's gone. And she stopped Rapa and never came back.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, can we do a single pulse of Rapa and do adverse clonal selection? And it's somewhat curative for quite a while in terms of stem cell quality. How we do that in a safe way, that's a real challenge. I mean, I think that's going to take a lot of thoughtful consideration.
Why is it a challenge? I mean, are you more worried about safety from a single acute dose than you are from chronic dosing?
How much is enough to really clear out the?
Sure.
Is it? Do you need a pulse of 20 milligram? Do you need a pulse of 40 milligram? Right. Where do you start getting a...
Right. I mean, I think there are basic fundamental questions that need to be researched.
I mean,
sure. Yeah.
It took the cancer guys a long time to understand this is the dose of cyclophosphamide that I need in order to, clear out, have adverse clonal selection in these bone marrow transplants, right? But everybody's too afraid of this topic to even start. Somebody has to start. Right.
Well, yeah, and again, I don't think we have very much data on acute dosing with rapamycin. Although some of the people who've been using rapamycin off-label have definitely pushed it into the 20, 40 milligram range routinely, and it's all anecdotal without significant toxicity.
Again, I have people on like 3 to 4 milligrams a day. There's zero change.
Yeah.
In their glucose and in their triglycerides.
Are they more susceptible to bacterial infections in your experience at those doses? I mean, that would be the thing most people would be worried about, right? It's primarily immune suppression and in particular bacterial infections.
Well, I think Joan Manick's point is a really good point, right? Is there's a group of people, and this is well known in immunology, right? This is actually a known cause of tuberculosis, which is an overgrowth syndrome in the cytotoxic T cells. And they just grow so fast in response to antigen, right, that they die. Right. They turn senescent or they become exhausted. And it's a risk factor for actually getting TB because you have a hyperactive immune system. So if we had better biomarkers.
No, I agree with you completely. I was just asking, in your experience, do your patients who are on 3 to 4 mgs a day typically seem to get more bacterial infections at a rate that you pick up on?
Right? I clearly have dropouts. There'll be some people that are on 1 milligram a day. They're getting benefit. You go up to 2 milligrams. They're saying, oh, I'm getting some thrush. or, I've had 3 urinary tract infections in the last week or something, but then again, it's all quality of life.
Yeah, of course.
Right. I mean, there's a million people on transplants right now that'll be like, hey, if I need antibiotics twice a year and my quality of life is fantastic, no problem.
Yeah, no, I'm in complete agreement with you. And I think that what you said is really important, that we always need to balance, the side effects with the benefit, for sure. Yeah. That's going to be very individual. Mostly I was just wondering from my own, knowledge and experience base at those doses, how prevalent are these kinds of side effects in terms, because it's my perception that at 6 mgs a week, it's pretty low, like barely detectable. If there is a signal, it's very small for bacterial infections, but also very individual.
What have I seen? I've seen capillary leak at 1 milligram. I've seen the mouth sores.
Yeah, the mouth sores is definitely...
The mouth sores is
15% ballpark of people.
I don't see them that often. Again, I think that's referral bias, right? It's really interesting, right? Referral bias means something. I think it's related to Behçet syndrome, which is, when you push the immune system in one direction, the other portion can kind of poke out, right? But I think last time you and I talked, I was like, I don't get these mouth sores. I get these mouth sores more. I think this is closer to Behçet's. And, this is where we need, really experienced rheumatologists, immunologists to be part of these teams.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Yeah. More than just the transplant people, right? Because the transplant people talk about how you manage it symptomatically. What we're really looking for are, the source code people.
Cool. Okay. Anything that we haven't touched on that you really feel like we should talk about?
I think just going back to, I think I sent you an email on ketamine, right? Going back to the talk that we had last year about how ketamine, probably is one of its targets is the M2 microglia. And there's a little bit more to that story since we've talked. Okay. So first of all, the microRNA testing that we talked about, when they looked at these patients with chronic pain and they did gene set enrichment, in a large enough group of things, what did they see? They saw pathways associated with TNF alpha, IL-1 beta, RNA polymerase 2, negative regulation, super interesting. And then the clinical pathways were related to psoriatic arthritis, graft versus host disease, and the drugs that they recommended in the chronic pain patient were ketamine, prednisone, rapamycin. Right? So, it's nice to see, that not only can we start with biomarkers, which is the RNA, say, hey, you should try this drug. But you get into things like RNA polymerase 2, which is one of the checkpoints for efferocytosis, digesting the corpses of dead synapses, right? So it's one of these sort of control functions. And in liver, RNase polymerase 2, 40% of it is stalled because it's seeing DNA damage. And it just sits there.
Right. Gets hung up on the
DNA damage. Yeah. So, this whole issue of like just going deeper and deeper into the source code because we have better tools, right? Now we have a tool that says, we should start to looking at RNA polymerase 2 as one of these causal factors for chronic pain. That's a major advance, right? And we have a commercial product that patients can get, and we don't have to wait for a grant to get funded.
Right. And just so I understand that the drug recommendation, ketamine, prednisone, rapamycin, that's an AI-based recommendation based
It's an AI-based. There's no human data
That's
yet.
Intriguing. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And then that's one portion I thought was very interesting, that we have something that's actually like logical in terms of saying, and it's commercially available.
Right.
Right.
What's the test called?
It's called MindX1.
MindX1. Okay. And is there anything new? Because we talked last time about the ketamine plus rapamycin data. Anything new there that's worth?
Well, I think I sent you an email on this, and I think it's really fascinating, which is, going back to Phil Morgan's work on anesthetic sensitivity, right? Luca Turin and Nick Lane have been looking at this concept that the reason anesthetics work is because they affect the polarization of the electron flux through complex 1, right? And that a polarized electrical field generates a magnetic field. And so if you're thinking about this very important issue of chaperones, alpha-synuclein is a cardiolipin chaperone, right? That the electron flux through complex 1 organizes the shape of the mitochondria. And, the ferric sulfide clusters are going to align in relation to complex 1, right? And so what do anesthetics do? I mean, something like xenon. Xenon has no chemical binding. How in the world could it act as an anesthetic other than it interrupts the electron flow, the polarization of the electron flow? Okay, and so then what happens? So then you get a collapse of the mitochondrial structure in the presynaptic neuron, right? And you get a mitochondrial unfolded protein response, right? And so you get a short-term effect, which is you get an anesthetic, but you get a longer-term effect, which is the mitochondrial unfolded protein response. And now we can start to think about this issue of like, what are anesthetics doing? In terms of subacute issues. And what does it mean when somebody is really sensitive to ketamine? Like, I have some people that are on 25 milligrams of ketamine. That's all they can take. And they're too sleepy. Okay, this is not a microglia phenomenon. This is somebody that has a defect in the presynaptic glutamatergic neuron, very similar to the ND4, which is in the membrane. It's not one of the actual charge carriers.
That's right. Yep, it's an accessory or
it's accessory,
stabilizing protein.
Right.
Yep.
And so now we have this terribly interesting question of like, ketamine's doing more and telling us more than simply it's an anti-inflammatory. If you listen to your patients carefully, you're gonna hear echoes of the ND4. And again, $20 bill, just right on the ground, and we need people to pick it up, and there aren't a lot of us. Yeah.
Well, and getting funding to do that kind of research is, again, going to be challenging for something like ketamine.
Yeah. Pretty tough.
So clinically, again, I'm intrigued by this interaction though between rapamycin and ketamine that I think you've talked about and that has been published on just a little bit, but I haven't been following it, but I haven't really seen any new studies there.
No.
Is there anything there, or do you feel like it's
the interaction between the two?
Well, or a combination when you combine them in patients?
I probably have at least 20 people on the combination.
Yeah,
at least.
And how do you choose who to put on the combination, or what would be the typical traits of somebody?
Again, I'm just trying to summarize, because there's people are all individuals. They're so individual. Usually what happens is you have a patient who has absolutely treatment-resistant pain or depression. They've tried everything. And I get people sent to me, typically by other physicians in the community, saying, hey, we're done. I don't know what to do. Right? And people start with ketamine because it's relatively cheap. And there's been a lot of ancillary data from the IV people. So it's credible. Yeah. It has face credibility, right? Rapa doesn't have face credibility yet. And you have to spend a lot of time doing informed consent. And some pharmacies will refuse to fill it.
Really?
Yeah, interesting.
Amazon Pharmacy doesn't.
No, I've had a pharmacist refuse to fill it. I actually sent a preprint of that paper saying, hey, I've been a multi-center trial with Mayo, and, it would be nice if you filled the patient's medication. Oh, no, we're not going to do that. right? So it has less face validity,
Yeah.
right? Um, the combo, again, we have to go to the basic science. I think when you do RNA analysis of the M2A and the M2C microglia, so the M2C is activated by steroid and IL-6, and the M2A is activated by IL-4. And RAPA tends to do IL-4, looks like an IL-4 M2A microglia, and ketamine's an M2C. Their transcription profile looks a little different. And I'm just not good enough to really know what that means from a physiological perspective. It looks like the M2As have more arginase. So, again, paracrine signaling, they're breaking down the precursors for nitric oxide, which is produced by the M1, right? So these cells are competing against each other, and they may be even competing within themselves in a paracrine way. For am I going to be an M1 or going to M2A? And then I think the M2C has HIF-1,3 alpha. Oh, hypoxia sensing, right? I mean, there's a lot of local physiology.
Yeah, sure, of course. But ultimately, right, I agree with you. Figuring out those mechanisms is the next step for the deep science. But ultimately, does a person respond or not, right, from a patient perspective?
Yeah, and they respond. But, I draw people a graph in my clinic. I say, look, let's look at a 2D space. Okay. One component at x-axis is your rapamycin dose. The other component is your ketamine dose. You and I will both be dead before we find the global optimum, right? Because we don't have an easy biomarker. I mean, we can guess, but our address is not going to be very precise, and I mean, it just goes back again and again to the readers, to the listeners, right? Dosing really matters.
So in the people you've got who are on both, is that typically still a daily dose of rapamycin, like one
Yeah,
milligram a day?
I hate to pulse people. It's just they got other medical conditions, and it's just so hard.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah. Interesting. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming by today. We've covered a lot of ground, a little bit of deep dive, a lot of concepts. And I think, I'm obviously going to continue to follow the lithium story, see where that goes. I think there's going to be a lot more research on it coming out soon. Any parting words you want to leave with our listeners?
I think you need to join Optispan.
Come on down to Optispan.
These are good guys,
yeah,
right?
We're trying to change the world.
They really are, doing their part.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that. And as always, love being able to spend time with you and talk about all of this cool biology.